February 24, 1991, and inside a cramped operations room on Frunzenskaya embankment in Moscow, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and something far heavier, dread. Outside, winter had locked the city in its brutal grip, but inside this room, 24 of the Soviet Union's most senior military officers sat in complete silence, their eyes glued to large screens broadcasting CNN's live coverage of Operation Desert Storm. At the front sat General Mikhail Moiseev, chief of the Soviet General Staff, just 52 years old and one of the youngest men to ever hold such a powerful position. He was a veteran of Afghanistan, a soldier who had climbed the ranks during the final gasps of the Cold War, and now as he watched American forces systematically tear apart the Iraqi military, an army that had been trained, equipped, and organized exactly like his own, he felt something close to nausea rising in his throat. His face was bathed in the blue glow of the monitors, and after a long pause, he spoke quietly to the technician beside him. "Rewind that. Show me the Apache attack again." The footage rolled backward, then forward, revealing night vision imagery in grainy green tones, showing American H-64 Apache helicopters engaging Iraqi positions with terrifying precision. The Iraqis never even saw them coming. Laser-guided Hellfire missiles streaked across the screen, and one by one, Iraqi tanks, Soviet-made T-72s, the very pride of Soviet armor design, exploded in brilliant white flashes that lit up the darkness. Colonel General Makhmet Ghariev, a decorated military theorist and historian who had fought in World War II, broke the silence with a voice that sounded hollow and distant. 34 tanks destroyed in the first 90 seconds, he said. They never even got a shot off. Behind them, younger officers muttered to each other in disbelief, some frantically scribbling notes, others simply staring at the screens with pale faces, frozen in shock. They were watching the future of warfare unfold before their eyes, and it looked nothing like anything they had prepared for, nothing like the doctrine they had spent their entire careers mastering. General Valentin Varenikov, commander of Soviet ground forces, suddenly stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to the screens as if he could somehow escape what he was seeing. At 64, he was old-school Soviet military through and through, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, a man who believed deeply in mass mobilization, in the inherent superiority of Soviet arms, in the inevitability of socialist victory. What he was watching on those screens challenged every single thing he had built his career on, every belief he had held sacred. "This is propaganda," he said without turning around. "American propaganda. They're exaggerating their success, making it look easier than it is. The Iraqis will counterattack. They have 1 million men under arms. They have." Valentin Ivanovich, Moiseev interrupted gently but firmly. "We have our own intelligence, our satellites, our observers in Baghdad. This is not propaganda. This is what is actually happening." Varenikov turned around. His face flushed red with anger and something that looked like fear. "Then the Iraqis are cowards," he said. "They're not fighting a real army. A Soviet army would never. A Soviet army would be destroyed just as quickly," said General Vladimir Ashilov, commander of the Volga-Urals military district, and his words landed like a bomb in the room. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, because it was one thing to think such a thing privately, it was another thing entirely to say it out loud in front of everyone. Varenikov looked like he'd been physically slapped. "You don't know that," he stammered. "Look at the screen," Ashilov said, his voice hard as steel. "The Iraqis are using our tactics, our equipment, our doctrine, everything we taught them, and they're being slaughtered, not defeated, slaughtered. There's a difference." On the screen, CNN was now showing footage of what would become known as the Highway of Death, the road from Kuwait to Basra where retreating Iraqi forces had been caught in the open by American aircraft. The images were apocalyptic, almost biblical in their horror. Hundreds of vehicles burned and twisted into unrecognizable shapes, bodies scattered among the wreckage like discarded toys. The desert itself transformed into a vast graveyard. General Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, commander of the Soviet Air Force, leaned forward and asked the question that was on everyone's mind: how many aircraft did they lose doing that? An intelligence officer quickly consulted his notes and answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "In that particular attack, none, sir. The Americans have lost a total of 38 aircraft in the entire campaign. The Iraqis have lost over 300, plus their entire integrated air defense system. Shaposhnikov closed his eyes as if in physical pain. He had spent his entire career in the Soviet Air Force, had personally helped design the doctrine that was supposed to give them air superiority over NATO in any European war, and now he was watching that same doctrine exported to Iraq, being torn apart by American technology and tactics he barely understood. Stealth aircraft, he said quietly, that's the key. Their F-117s took out the air defense network in the first hours. Without air defense, everything else collapses. His deputy, General Denikin, spoke up with even worse news. We have nothing that can match stealth, nothing even close. Our best radars can't see them. Our missiles can't hit them. They can strike anywhere, anytime, and we can't stop them. Moiseev stood and walked to the front of the room, facing his officers directly, and he looked utterly exhausted, not just from the late hour, though for the past 3 days since the ground war had begun he had barely slept, but from the weight of the realization that was crushing down on all of them. Comrades, he said, we need to face reality. What we are watching is not just the defeat of Iraq. It is the obsolescence of Soviet military doctrine. Everything we have prepared for, everything we have trained for, is being proven wrong in real time. That's defeatist talk, Vorenikov said angrily. We are the Soviet army. We defeated Nazi Germany. We defeated Nazi Germany with mass mobilization and massive casualties. Moiseev interrupted. 27 million dead. We won through sheer numbers and willingness to sacrifice. But this, he gestured at the screens, this is a different kind of war, precision weapons, stealth technology, real-time intelligence, network-centric warfare. We have none of these things. He paused to let his words sink in, watching the faces of his fellow officers as the truth settled over them like a shroud. The Americans are fighting a 21st century war, he continued. We are still prepared to fight a 20th century war, and if we ever faced them in actual combat, we would lose badly. The meeting broke up near midnight, but Moiseev asked several senior officers to remain behind: Gareev, Shaposhnikov, and General Vladimir Lobov, first Deputy Chief of the General Staff. They moved to a smaller conference room, away from the junior officers and the ever-present political officers who reported everything back to the Communist Party. Moiseev poured vodka into 5 glasses and passed them around, and for a long moment they simply sat in silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them like a physical force. How did this happen? Shaposhnikov asked finally. How did they get so far ahead of us? Gareev, the military historian, was the one who answered. It's been building for 20 years, he said. After Vietnam, the Americans completely reformed their military. They studied their failures, they developed new doctrine. They invested in technology, precision weapons, stealth, satellites, computers. Meanwhile he trailed off, shaking his head. Meanwhile we stagnated. Lobov finished for him. We kept building the same tanks, the same aircraft, the same doctrine. We assumed that what worked in 1945 would work forever. We were wrong. It's not just technology, Moiseev said, leaning forward. Did you see how they operated? The coordination between air and ground forces, the speed of decision-making, the initiative given to junior officers. That's not just equipment, that's culture, that's a different way of thinking about warfare. He pulled out a folder and opened it carefully. I've been reading American military journals, he said. After Vietnam, they developed something called airland battle doctrine. The idea is to use deep strikes and maneuver warfare to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, not just to occupy territory. They integrate all their forces, air, ground, naval, space-based assets into a single system. We have integrated operations, Vorenikov protested weakly. We have coordination, Moiseev corrected him. That's different. The Americans have real integration. Every soldier, every tank, every aircraft is networked together. They share information in real time. A pilot can see what a ground commander sees. A tank crew can call in air support and have it arrive in minutes. That's not coordination, that's a system. Shaposhnikov nodded slowly, finally understanding the full scope of their problem. And we have nothing like it, he said. Our communications are decades behind. Our computers are primitive. Our doctrine still assumes that we'll fight the way we fought in World War II, mass formations, breakthrough operations, exploitation. Which is exactly what the Iraqis tried to do, Gareev added. They massed their forces in Kuwait, they dug in, they prepared for a frontal assault, and the Americans simply went around them, cut them off, and destroyed them piecemeal. Lobov poured himself another vodka with a trembling hand. So what do we do? He asked. How do we close this gap? The room fell silent again because they all knew the answer, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. We can't, Moiseev said finally, not with our current economy, not with our current technology base. The Americans spend 3 times what we spend on defense, and their economy is 4 times larger. They can afford to develop stealth aircraft and precision weapons and satellite networks. We can barely afford to maintain what we have. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Moscow night, at the city that represented the heart of an empire that was dying. The Soviet Union is collapsing, comrades, he said quietly. We all know it. The economy is in freefall. The republics are demanding independence. The Communist Party is losing control. And our military, the great Soviet army that defeated Hitler, is obsolete. So we just surrender, Vorenikov said bitterly. We just accept American hegemony? We accept reality, Moiseev said, turning to face them. And reality is that we cannot compete militarily with the United States, not now, maybe not ever. Across Moscow, in a nondescript building near Lubyanka Square, another group of Soviet officers was watching the same footage, but these were not general staff officers. These were GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and their analysis was even more pessimistic, even more brutal in its honesty. Colonel General Yevgeny Timokhin, head of GRU, sat with his senior analysts reviewing classified reports from Soviet observers embedded in Iraq, and unlike the sanitized CNN footage the general staff was watching, these reports included detailed assessments of Iraqi casualties, equipment losses, and the complete breakdown of command and control. The Republican Guard divisions have ceased to exist as fighting formations. One analyst reported in a flat voice, the Tawakalna division, their best unit, was destroyed in less than 6 hours. The Americans lost 12 men. The Iraqis lost an estimated 3,000 with another 5,000 captured. 6 hours, Timokhin repeated, letting the words hang in the air. The Tawakalna division was equipped with our best export equipment, T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, SA-6 air defense systems, and it was destroyed in 6 hours. Not destroyed, the analyst corrected carefully, annihilated. There's a difference. Destroyed means they fought and lost. Annihilated means they barely had a chance to fight. Another analyst spoke up nervously. Sir, we need to talk about the implications for our own forces. The Americans demonstrated capabilities we didn't know they had. Their intelligence was perfect. They knew where every Iraqi unit was down to individual battalions. Their precision weapons hit targets with meter-level accuracy. Their stealth aircraft operated with complete impunity. And their logistics, another added, they moved 500,000 troops and all their equipment halfway around the world in 6 months. Then they sustained them in combat operations with no supply problems. We can barely sustain operations in Afghanistan, which shares a border with us. Timokhin nodded grimly, understanding flooding through him. He had been arguing for years that the Soviet military was falling behind, but no one wanted to listen. The political leadership wanted to hear that the Soviet army was invincible, the general staff wanted to believe that Soviet doctrine was superior, and the defense industry wanted to keep building the same equipment they had been building for decades. I'm preparing a report for the president, Timokhin said. I'm going to tell him that if we ever fought a conventional war with NATO, we would lose decisively. The only thing that keeps us safe is our nuclear arsenal. You'll be accused of defeatism, one of his deputies warned. I'll be accused of telling the truth, Timokhin corrected, and right now that's more important than my career. On February 28, 1991, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began, President George H.W. Bush ordered a ceasefire. The Iraqi army had been routed. Kuwait had been liberated. The war was over. In Moscow, the Soviet military leadership gathered one final time to assess what had happened. And the mood was funereal, heavy with the weight of an empire's death. Moiseev presented his conclusions to a small group that included Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov and several members of the Politburo, and his report was blunt to the point of being brutal, holding nothing back. The Gulf War has demonstrated that Soviet military doctrine is obsolete. He began without preamble, our equipment, our tactics, our training, our organization, all of it is a generation behind the Americans. If we faced NATO in a conventional war, we would lose. Yazov, a hardliner who had opposed Gorbachev's reforms from the beginning, bristled visibly. "That's unacceptable," he said. "We need to modernize, to do what?" Moiseev interrupted. "To spend money we don't have on technology we can't develop. Comrade Minister, our economy is collapsing. We can't even pay our soldiers on time. How are we going to develop stealth aircraft and precision weapons?" He clicked through to the next slide showing comparative defense spending in stark numbers. "The Americans spend $300 billion per year on defense," he said. "We spend about $150 billion, and most of that goes to maintaining our nuclear forces and paying personnel. We have nothing left for modernization." "Then we need to increase defense spending," said one of the Politburo members. "With what?" Moiseev asked, spreading his hands. "We're running out of hard currency. Our factories are outdated. Our technology base is decades behind. Even if we had unlimited money, we couldn't catch up. The Americans have too much of a lead." General Gariev spoke up from the back of the room. "There's another factor we need to consider," he said. "The Gulf War wasn't just a military victory for the Americans. It was a political victory. They assembled a coalition of 30 countries. They got UN approval. They had Arab states fighting alongside them against another Arab state. That's unprecedented. And it means," Moiseev added, "that the Americans have won the ideological war. Countries want to align with them, not with us. Our model, the Soviet model, is seen as a failure. And after what the world just watched in Iraq, our military model is seen as a failure too." The room was silent. These were truths that no one wanted to speak aloud. But they could no longer be denied, could no longer be ignored or explained away. Finally, Yazov spoke in a voice that sounded defeated. "So what do you recommend?" Moiseev took a deep breath. "I recommend that we fundamentally rethink our defense posture," he said. "We cannot compete with the Americans in conventional forces. We need to accept that our security will have to depend on our nuclear deterrent and on diplomacy, not on the ability to win a conventional war." "That's surrender," Vorenikov said bitterly. "That's reality," Moiseev replied. "And if we don't accept it, we'll bankrupt ourselves trying to compete in an arms race we can't win." In the weeks and months that followed, the implications of the Gulf War rippled through the Soviet military establishment like an earthquake, shaking every foundation they had built. Officers who had spent their careers preparing to fight NATO realized that their plans were worthless. Defense industries that had built thousands of tanks and aircraft realized that their products were obsolete. Military academies that had taught Soviet doctrine for decades realized they needed to completely revise their curriculum. But there was no money for reform, no resources, no time. The Soviet economy was in its final death spiral, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. In August 1991, just 6 months after the Gulf War ended, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, partly motivated by fear that he was letting the Soviet Union and its military collapse without a fight. The coup failed spectacularly, but it accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent, pushing the Soviet Union over the edge it had been teetering on. By December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, dissolved into 15 separate republics, and the military that had watched the Americans destroy Iraq found itself without a country to serve. The officers who had gathered in that operations room to watch CNN scattered to different republics, different careers, different lives, their world utterly transformed. Some, like Moiseev, tried to reform the Russian military that emerged from the Soviet collapse, working tirelessly to modernize and adapt. But without money, without technology, without the political will to make hard choices, their efforts largely failed. The Russian military of the 1990s became a shadow of the Soviet military, underfunded, demoralized, riddled with corruption. Others like Vorenikov never accepted what they had seen. They continued to believe that Soviet doctrine was sound, that Soviet equipment was adequate, that the Gulf War was just an aberration, a fluke. They blamed the Iraqis for poor performance, blamed Gorbachev for betraying the military, blamed everyone except themselves for the obsolescence they had witnessed with their own eyes. But a few younger officers, colonels and majors who had watched the Gulf War very carefully, began to think differently, began to see new possibilities. They studied American doctrine with intense focus, they analyzed what had worked and what hadn't, they began to develop new ideas about how to fight a modern war even with limited resources, how to use asymmetric warfare and hybrid tactics to compensate for technological inferiority. One of those officers was a young colonel named Valery Gerasimov, who would eventually become chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces decades later. Another was Vladimir Putin, a KGB officer stationed in Dresden who watched the Gulf War unfold and drew his own conclusions about American power and Russian weakness, conclusions that would shape his worldview forever. Years later, when asked about the Gulf War in an interview, Moiseev would say with quiet resignation, "We knew we were behind the Americans, but we didn't know how far behind until we watched them destroy an army trained and equipped exactly like ours. It was like watching our own funeral." Gareev, the military historian, would write in his memoirs, "The Gulf War marked the end of the Soviet military era. Everything we had built since 1945, our doctrine, our equipment, our way of thinking about war, was proven obsolete in 100 hours. We had been preparing to fight World War II again, and the Americans had moved on to a completely different kind of warfare." And Shaposhnikov, who would briefly serve as the last defense minister of the Soviet Union before it dissolved, would reflect years later, "The tragedy was not that we lost the Cold War. The tragedy was that we lost it and didn't realize it until we watched the Americans destroy Iraq. By then it was too late to do anything about it." What Soviet commanders said when they watched the U.S. destroy the Iraqi army in 100 hours was in essence this: "We are finished, not defeated in battle because they never fought that battle, but rendered obsolete by technology, doctrine, and economics they could not match, could not replicate, could not compete with." They said it in different ways, some with anger, some with resignation, some with bitter denial, but they all understood the fundamental truth that could not be escaped. The Soviet military, which had defeated Nazi Germany at enormous cost and held the line against NATO for 45 years, could not compete with the American military of 1991, and that realization, more than any political decision, more than any economic crisis, marked the true end of the Soviet Union as a superpower. Because a nation that cannot defend itself, that cannot project power, that cannot compete militarily with its rivals, is not a superpower. It is just another country struggling to survive in a world that has passed it by, left it behind in the dust of history. The Gulf War didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, historians would later agree, but it revealed that collapse to the Soviet military leadership in a way that could not be denied or ignored or explained away with propaganda. And in that operations room on Frunzenskaya embankment, watching American forces systematically dismantle an army that looked exactly like theirs, that used their weapons and their tactics and their doctrines, Soviet commanders saw their own future projected on those screens, and it absolutely terrified them.